Okay, real quick, before we get into any of this, I need you to imagine something with me. Picture a group of guys, ancient, serious, very much not messing around, who sat in the Judean desert about 2,000 years ago. No phones, no internet, no satellite imagery. And they wrote down a set of predictions about the future. Not vague stuff, not there will be wars and rumors of wars. I mean specific. Dates, sequences, names of historical ages, mathematical cycles, written on animal skins and stuffed into clay jars in desert caves. And here's where it starts getting weird, because some of those predictions, they already came true. One of them was so specific that it pointed to a year that basically defined modern history. Another one pointed to a country that didn't even exist when they wrote it. And the ones they haven't yet checked off their list? Those start around now. Ken Johnson has spent years, honestly, most of his adult life, digging through these ancient documents, and what he found buried inside the math, inside the calendar system, inside fragments that mainstream scholarship largely ignores, is a timeline. A window of time that the Essenes believed would be the most significant, chaotic, and transformative stretch in all of human history. That window opens somewhere around 2025, and according to their math, it closes around 2032. Remember, we're not here to preach. We're not declaring anything as prophecy. We're here to look at what these ancient guys wrote, how the math works, what's already checked out historically, and ask the honest question, is this worth paying attention to? So, let's get into it.
Let's start at the beginning, because if you're going to understand the 2025-2032 window, you first have to understand who wrote it. Most people, when they think about ancient Jewish groups, think Pharisees, the guys in robes with all the rules, or Sadducees, the temple aristocracy crowd. But there's a third group that most mainstream teaching kind of glosses over, and that's the Essenes. The Essenes were essentially the outsider intellectuals of their day, hardcore scholars, extremely rigorous, and they had a very specific belief that the mainstream Jewish religious system had been completely corrupted. They didn't just disagree with the Pharisees on a few interpretations, they believed the Jerusalem priesthood had sold out to Babylon, literally. After the Babylonian captivity, the Jews came back from exile and, according to the Essenes, brought Babylonian religious practices with them, including a switch from the original solar calendar that God ordained to creation to a pagan lunar-based system. And the Essenes viewed that as a catastrophic error that contaminated every subsequent religious observance. So they left. They packed up and moved to the desert near Qumran, on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. And there, in this extraordinarily harsh environment, they built a community, a kind of ancient monastery meets academic research center. They copied and preserved ancient texts, they wrote their own commentaries, and they obsessively tracked what they believed was the true divine calendar, the one that, in their view, had been running since the very first day of creation. Now here's something most people skip over. The Essenes weren't just fringe weirdos living in caves eating bugs. Josephus, one of the most credible Jewish historians of the first century, wrote extensively about them. He described them as having serious influence, having members throughout Judea, and being known for their uncanny ability to predict future events. He didn't say that lightly. Josephus was a careful writer. The Pharisees hated them enough to actively want them dead. That's kind of the ultimate endorsement that you've hit a nerve. So this community flourished for roughly 2 centuries, and they were careful, deliberate people who kept records of everything. Then, in 68 CE, as the Roman legions were rolling through Judea crushing the Jewish revolt, the Essenes knew their community was finished. So before the Romans arrived, they did something extraordinary. They took their most precious documents, hundreds of manuscripts, some of them copies of ancient texts going back to the patriarchs, sealed them in clay jars, and hid them in a series of limestone caves in the cliffs above their settlement. And then, silence. The community was gone. The scrolls sat in those jars, in those caves, in that desert, untouched for nearly 1900 years. Now, the year they were found, pay attention to this, was 1947, which means they were rediscovered just one single year before the modern state of Israel declared independence in May of 1948. We'll come back to why that timing matters, because the Essenes themselves wrote something very specific about the number 1948 that will make your brain do a little flip. Between 1947 and 1956, archaeologists found roughly 900 separate manuscripts across 11 caves. That collection became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we're still not done translating all of them. Most people know about the Dead Sea Scrolls vaguely. Oh yeah, ancient Bible stuff. But inside those 900 documents is an entire layer of material that doesn't just copy the Old Testament. There's commentary, there's theology, there's history. And buried in there is a complete functioning calendar system that the Essenes believed contained the blueprint of all time, from creation to the end of the age. And that's where Ken Johnson walks in.
Dr. Ken Johnson is not a household name outside of very specific circles. He runs a website called BibleFacts.org. He's written around 24 books on ancient manuscripts. He's not a celebrity pastor with a stadium church. He's more like the academic uncle who comes to Thanksgiving dinner and says something that derails every conversation for the next 3 hours. What makes Johnson unusual is the level of access he has. He's worked with digital reproductions of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls digital library made them publicly accessible, and he spent years doing something that most scholars either don't have the time or the interest to do. He cross-references the Essene material with the broader biblical narrative and the historical record, and he tracks where the calendar actually lines up with things that happened. He's also careful, and I want to give him credit for this, to acknowledge where there's uncertainty. He'll often say, "This is what the scrolls says, here's how the math works, and here's where I think it points." He leaves the conclusion to the audience. He's not selling fear, he's presenting a framework. So let me walk you through what he found, because it starts with something that sounds completely mundane. A calendar, and ends somewhere that should, at minimum, make you sit up a little straighter. The Essene calendar is a 364-day solar calendar. That's the first thing to understand. Our modern Gregorian calendar has 365 days, 366 in a leap year. The traditional Jewish religious calendar is lunar, based on moon cycles, which runs about 354 days per year and has to insert extra months periodically to stay synchronized with the seasons. The Essene calendar does neither. It runs on exactly 364 days, 12 months of 30 days each, plus 4 special Tekufa days. That's a Hebrew word for seasonal turning points. Think equinoxes and solstices. Those 4 days are not part of any week or month. They stand alone as sacred boundary markers. And here is the quietly brilliant thing about this structure. 364 divides perfectly by 7. That means every single festival, every holy day, every celebration falls on the same day of the week every single year, without exception. No drift, no adjustment. The calendar is mechanically perfect in a way that the lunar calendar is not, and in a way that the Gregorian calendar is not. The Essenes believed this was not accidental. They believed this was the design God encoded into creation from day one, And they believed the Pharisees' adoption of the Babylonian lunar calendar was a deliberate spiritual corruption, and they wrote, hundreds of years before it fully happened, that the Jewish people would one day completely abandon the true solar calendar for a pagan one, which is, by most historical accounts, exactly what happened. But here's the question that starts the whole detective story. If this calendar really does track from the first moment of creation, and the Essenes believed with absolute conviction it did, then where are we on that timeline right now, and when does it end? That's the number that starts pointing towards 2025.
Before we get to the math, I need to show you one data point. Just one. Because it's the thing that converted a lot of skeptics, myself included, into, okay, I at least need to keep listening territory. The Essene calendar counts time from creation using a system called Anno Mundi, AM, Year of the World. So year 1 AM is year 1 of creation. Year 1000 AM is 1,000 years after creation, and so on. Here's the data point. According to the Essene calendar, the patriarch Abraham was born in the year 1948 AM, and the modern nation of Israel was founded in the year 1948 AD, a 4,000-year gap to the exact number. Now, before you dismiss that as numerology, let me tell you that this isn't the only one. The Essene calendar records the children of Israel arriving at Mount Sinai in year 2448 AM. They left Egypt in 2448 AM, and the research documentary Patterns of Evidence, Exodus, which used mainstream archaeology, not religious sources, identified an Exodus event that maps directly to that same time period when adjusted on the revised Egyptian chronology. The calendar also nailed 1967, the Israeli recapture of Jerusalem during the Six-Day War. Johnson found that the Jubilee cycle running on the Essene calendar flagged 1967 as a significant year of return. 3 major modern events, 3 hits, 0 misses on the ones we can verify. So when this same calendar starts pointing at a specific window for a 7-year period of upheaval, you can see why people stop laughing and start paying attention. Now, how does the math actually work? The Essene understanding of history isn't random, it's structured, and the structure is something you can actually follow without a theology degree. Here's how they laid it out. The Essenes believed total human history, from creation to the final age of rest, spans 7,000 years, not symbolic, literal years. And that 7,000-year total breaks down into 4 distinct ages. Age 1, the age of chaos, runs from creation, year 1 AM, to year 2000 AM. This is the period from Adam to roughly Abraham, the age before structured covenant relationship. Things are messy. You've got the fall, you've got Cain and Abel, you've got the flood, you've got the Tower of Babel. Humanity is just kind of careening around. Age 2, the age of Torah, runs from roughly 2000 AM to 4000 AM. This is the Abraham to 1st century era, the era of covenant, law, temple, and sacrifice. It ends around 75 AD when the temple was destroyed and the entire sacrificial system collapsed. Age 3, the age of grace, also called the Church Age, runs from approximately 4000 AM to 6000 AM. This is the age we are currently in. It began around the 1st century, and according to the Essene calendar's math, it ends around the year 2032 AD. Age 4, the millennial age of rest, the final 1,000 years, year 6000 AM to 7000 AM, modeled after God resting on the 7th day of creation. The Essenes believed this would be an era of peace and restoration under the direct reign of the Messiah. Now, this framework isn't uniquely Essene, interestingly enough. Several early church fathers, Irenaeus writing around 170 AD in his work Against Heresies, and Victorinus of Patau writing around 260 AD, both independently described the same basic structure: 6,000 years of human history followed by a 1,000-year rest, the template of Creation Week mapped onto all of human time.
But what the Essenes did that nobody else did is they built a calendar precise enough to actually calculate where you are in that 7,000-year arc. And they didn't just work in years, they worked in nested cycles. Think of it like Russian nesting dolls. At the smallest level, you have a Shemitah, a 7-year cycle, just like the biblical 7-year Sabbath rest for the land. Stack 7 Shemitahs and you get 49 years, plus a 50th year called a Jubilee, a year of release and restoration. Stack 10 Jubilees and you get 500 years, which the Essenes called an Ona. Stack 4 Onas and you get 2,000 years, one complete age. The total run of ages 1 through 3, the 3 non-millennial ages, contains exactly 120 Jubilees. 120 times 50 years is 6,000 years. That's not a coincidence. Moses was 120 years old when he died, on the threshold of the Promised Land, but not yet inside it. The Essenes viewed that as a metaphor encoded into history itself. 120 Jubilees of human struggle, and then the Promised Land of the millennial rest. Now, here's where the 2032 date comes from, and the math is actually quite clean when you trace it. The age of Torah, age 2, ran from 2000 AM to 4000 AM. Using the Essene chronology, year 4000 AM corresponds to approximately 2526 AD. That means the age of Torah had its last Jubilee period running from approximately 26 AD to 75 AD. Inside that last Jubilee, what happened? Jesus began his ministry around 26-27 AD. He was crucified in 32 AD. The early church launched, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. The last Jewish sacrificial system, the temple in Leontopolis in Egypt, was forcibly shut down by Rome in 73 AD. The Torah age didn't just end, it was dramatically concluded inside that final Jubilee. And that pattern, that the most significant events cluster inside the final Jubilee of an age, is something Johnson says the Essenes explicitly wrote about. So the question becomes, if the Torah age's final Jubilee ran from 26 AD to 75 AD, when does the Church age's final Jubilee run? The Church age runs from approximately 4000 AM, 26 AD, to 6000 AM. If you add 2,000 years to 26 AD, you land at approximately 2026 AD. Add a few years of alignment for where the Jubilee cycle sits, and the last Jubilee of the Church age begins somewhere between 2025 and 2026, and it runs until 2075. That's the window, the entire last Jubilee of the Age of Grace. But, and here's where the 2032 date gets refined. If the pattern from the Torah age holds, the most concentrated pivotal events happen at the beginning of that last Jubilee, not scattered across the whole 50 years. The crucifixion happened in year 7 of the Torah age's final Jubilee, 32 AD, which is 7 years after the Jubilee started in 26 AD. The temple destruction happened in year 45, 70 AD, 45 years in. The final endpoint was 75 AD, 50 years in. If you mirror that pattern onto the Church age's final Jubilee, which starts around 2025-2026, then year 7 would land around 2032. That's the 2025-2032 window. But it didn't come from vague pattern matching. It came from one specific scroll that Johnson identifies as the key that unlocked the whole system.
Here's the crazy thing. Before Ken Johnson published his findings, there was this specific Dead Sea Scroll. Scholars had translated it. Academics had written papers about it. It was sitting there in the public record, and nobody had made the connection Johnson made. The scroll is called the 11Q13 document, also known as the Melchizedek scroll. And Johnson says when you read what it says and then line it up against the Essene calendar, it doesn't just point to an abstract future event. It points to an exact year, the year 32 AD, which would mean that around 2100 years ago, a group of Jewish scholars in the Judean desert predicted the death of Jesus to within a single year. Let me show you how. The 11Q13 scroll was found in Cave 11 at Qumran, hence the 11Q. The Q is for Qumran. The 13 means it was the 13th document found in that cave. It's written in Hebrew, dates to approximately 100 BC, and it is, when you read the actual text, completely wild. The scroll describes a figure called Melchizedek. If you know your Old Testament, Melchizedek appears briefly in Genesis. He's a mysterious priest-king who Abraham pays a tithe to after a battle, and then he essentially vanishes from the text. He reappears in one verse of Psalms and gets a full theological treatment in the New Testament book of Hebrews. But there's a whole underground Jewish tradition around him that the mainstream reading of the Bible doesn't really surface. In the 11Q13 scroll, Melchizedek is described as a heavenly figure, a divine warrior, who at a specific appointed time will come to liberate the captives from the power of Belial, which is the Essene word for the adversary, the dark force opposing God. He'll forgive iniquities, he'll restore, he'll execute judgment on evil. Sound familiar? Johnson points out that this description in a pre-Christian Jewish text reads almost identically to what the New Testament says about what Jesus came to do. Not because he's conflating the two, but because he's arguing that the Essenes had a theology of the Messiah that was remarkably close to the Christian understanding, built entirely from the Hebrew scriptures before Jesus was born. But here's the kicker. The scroll is very specific about when this event would happen. The text says, and I'm paraphrasing the translation, that this liberation event would occur at the end of the first week of the Jubilee that follows the 9 Jubilees, and that the Day of Atonement is the end of the 10th Jubilee. That language is precise, and when you understand the Jubilee counting system, you can work it backward. Johnson's calculation goes like this. The Torah age ends at year 4000 AM, which corresponds to approximately 75 AD. Working backwards from that point, the last Jubilee of the Torah age would have started 50 years prior, around 26 AD. The first Shemitah, the first 7-year block within that Jubilee, would end in year 7 of the Jubilee. 26 AD plus 7 years equals 32 AD. The scroll says the liberation event, the forgiveness of iniquities, the defeat of Belial's power, happens at the end of the first week of the Shemitah of the last Jubilee. End of the first Shemitah of the last Jubilee of the Torah age equals 32 AD. Johnson publishes this and runs through the historical confirmation. Most mainstream scholars put the crucifixion somewhere between 30 AD and 33 AD. 32 AD lands solidly within that window, and some independent calculations, including astronomers working backwards on the calendar of known Passover dates, have specifically identified April 6, 32 AD as a candidate date for the crucifixion. The scroll also references the passage from Isaiah 61, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, to set the captives free, which is the exact passage that Jesus reads in the synagogue at the start of his ministry in Luke chapter 4, and then says, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." The Essenes wrote a commentary on that passage 100 years before Jesus was born, and assigned it a specific date on their calendar. Think about what that means for a second. Now, Johnson's position, and this is important to be fair to him, is not that the Essenes predicted all of this with prophetic genius as an independent source. His argument is that they were working from the same ancient sources, the Torah, Psalms, the prophets, plus books like Enoch and Jasher that didn't make it into the Protestant canon, and were able, using their calendar system, to calculate the timing. The scroll essentially worked out the same prophecy timeline that Daniel worked out in his famous 70 weeks passage and got to the same approximate destination. If that calculation was correct, and we now have nearly 2,000 years of hindsight to check it against, then the same calendar system, the same Jubilee math, applied to the end of the church age, starts pointing at the same kind of concentrated window. And now we need to talk about the specifics of what the Essenes said would mark that window.
Here's where it starts feeling less like ancient history and more like reading tomorrow's newspaper.
The Essenes didn't just calculate dates. In their commentaries on the prophets, and in several non-biblical texts that Johnson has been translating, they described specific signs that they believed would precede and accompany the final tribulation period. Some of these are general, a couple of them are startlingly specific. Sign 1. The return of Israel. This one is almost too clean to be uncomfortable. The Essene commentary on certain prophetic texts described the people of Israel being scattered and then, near the end of the age, being gathered back to their land. This is standard prophetic territory. Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah all say versions of this. But the Essenes add a layer. They connect it to a specific year count from creation. We already covered the 1948 AM Abraham connection, but Johnson also points to the structure of ages. If the Third Age began with the events of the first century, and Israel's rebirth marks the beginning of the countdown to the end of the Third Age, then the founding of Israel in 1948 AD functions as a kind of reset button on the prophetic clock. 1948 to 2025 is 77 years, or, if you count from the Six-Day War and the recapture of Jerusalem in 1967, 1967 to 2025 is 58 years, which sits just inside the traditional generation markers that various biblical calculations reference. The Essene text specifically mentions a 70-year period between the return of the state of Israel and the tribulation, and 1948 plus 70 equals 2018, which could mean the countdown started around 2018, depending on how you count the start of the period. None of these are perfect mathematical locks, but the clustering is hard to ignore. Sign 2. A war in Gaza. This one is blunt and specific, and Johnson has been talking about it since well before October 2023 and the subsequent war that has continued into 2024 and 2025. He was not making a prediction, he was reporting what the ancient text said. The fact that this war began when it did, in the location specified, within what Johnson's calendar framework identifies as the run-up to the tribulation window, is a remarkable coincidence, or it is not. Sign 3. An evil Gentile king with 10 nations. The Essenes wrote, based on their reading of the prophets, that there would arise a Gentile, not Jewish, who would establish dominion over Israel with the backing of a coalition of 10 nations, and this ruler's reign would last exactly 7 years. If you've read anything about biblical eschatology, you recognize this as a description of what the prophets call the Antichrist. But it's interesting that the Essenes reached this conclusion from their own reading of Daniel, Ezekiel, and other texts centuries before any Christian theological framework existed. They saw it as inevitable. At the end of the Age of Grace, a foreign king backed by a 10-nation coalition would have a 7-year window of power. 7 years. Which, if the window opens in 2025, closes in 2032. Sign 4. The Shemitah pattern. Johnson also points out that the 2014 to 2015 Shemitah year saw major global financial disruption. The 2021 to 2022 Shemitah period saw the post-COVID economic instability. The next major Shemitah in the 7-year cycle points to 2028 to 2029. This isn't a prediction, it's a pattern that financial analysts, not just religious researchers, have noted. Jonathan Cahn's work on the Shemitah mapped these disruptions against the 7-year biblical cycle and found a disturbing consistency going back decades.
If the tribulation window is 2025 to 2032, then 2028 to 2029 would sit at the midpoint, which in prophetic literature is described as the moment when the period shifts from difficult to catastrophic. And now I need to tell you about a rock in space, because this is the part that made astronomers go quiet. Tom Horn, a researcher who has worked closely with Ken Johnson, had a dream years ago about an asteroid impacting the Earth. He wrote about it before he even knew the specific details. Then he went looking and found a real asteroid called Apophis, first discovered in 2004. NASA's initial calculations gave Apophis a roughly 2.7% chance of hitting Earth, which sounds small when you realize that's an extraordinarily high probability for an asteroid of that size in that orbit. The close approach date? April 2029. That would place it at almost exactly the midpoint of the 2025-2032 window. Now, before you start building a bunker, updated calculations have significantly reduced the collision probability. But here's what hasn't changed. Apophis will pass closer to Earth in April 2029 than the orbit of some of our own communication satellites. It will be visible to the naked eye. For anyone watching the night sky in April of 2029, a large rock with a history of alarming scientists will pass through the satellite belt. And the Book of Revelation, in its description of the tribulation period, describes something called wormwood, an object that falls from the sky into the sea and makes the waters bitter. Astronomers and Bible scholars have long debated what that could be. Tom Horn, a researcher who has worked closely with Ken Johnson, are careful to say, maybe it's Apophis, maybe it's not. But the timing is notable.
Let me give you the piece of this that Johnson says ties the whole framework together. Because everything we've covered, the calendar, the ages, the jubilees, the signs, can feel like separate data points. But there's one passage in the Old Testament that, viewed through the Essene calendar, seems to function as a one-sentence summary of the whole timeline. It's Hosea chapter 6, verse 2. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, that we may live in his sight. Standard reading, it's a poetic description of restoration. 2 days of suffering, third day of revival. Most people read it as a direct reference to resurrection, but there's an ancient interpretive tradition running through both Jewish and early Christian sources that says in prophetic literature, a day can represent 1,000 years. The Psalms say, 1,000 years in your sight are like a day. Peter references this in the New Testament. If a prophetic day is 1,000 years, then after 2 days is after 2,000 years. On the third day he will raise us up is on the third 1,000 years, meaning at the beginning of the third millennium. 2,000 years after the crucifixion in 32 AD is the year 2032. This is not Johnson's invention. The early church fathers read this passage eschatologically. Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, Irenaeus shortly after, they referenced this idea of the third day as a prophetic marker. But when you combine it with the Essene calendar's Jubilee math pointing at 2025 as the start of the final Jubilee, and 2032 as the approximate midpoint or watershed moment of that final Jubilee, the two systems independently arrive at the same destination. 32 AD plus 2,000 years equals 2032. Now, let's be honest about something, because intellectual honesty is what separates useful research from confirmation bias. The Essene calendar, as brilliant as it is, has a known problem. It runs on 364 days a year, not 365.25. That means it drifts against the solar year over time.
Johnson is aware of this and accounts for it in his calculations, but any time you're projecting 2,000 years forward, small discrepancies compound. Different scholars interpreting the same data have landed on 2032, 2068, and even 2075 as possible end-of-age markers. The 2068 number is interesting if you take 1948 as the starting point of the fig tree generation that Jesus references in the Olivet Discourse, and apply an 80-year maximum lifespan from Psalm 90, which says, "Our days are 70 years, and by reason of strength, 80. You land at 2028 for the tribulation's end, which backs you up to 2021 for the start. That's the conservative calculation. If the generation is measured differently, 2032 and 2068 are also in play. What this means practically is Ken Johnson's 2025 to 2032 calculation is one valid reading of the Essene material. It has strong supporting data. It does not have unanimous agreement even among people who take the Essene calendar seriously. But here is what is hard to dismiss. In the Essene framework, we are unambiguously inside the final Jubilee of the Church Age. 2025, give or take a few years on either end, is the opening of that final 50-year Jubilee. Whether the most significant events happen at year 7, 2032, or later, the framework says we're in the last stretch. And the specific signs, the return of Israel, a war in Gaza, the Shemitah pattern, geopolitical coalitions, the configuration of global power, are not things the Essenes invented from thin air. They cross-referenced the same prophetic texts we have access to. They were just reading them without the centuries of theological domestication that makes most modern Christians skim past them.